Welcome, friends, to Breakfast in the Ruins, a Michael Moorcock-flavoured podcast. On this show, we're looking at a collection of tales that Mike edited and introduced to a whole new audience in 1975. Before Armageddon, an anthology of Victorian and Edwardian imaginative fiction originally published in periodicals and short fiction magazines during the period between the 1860s and 1914, just before the First World War. I'm going to read a bit of Mike's lengthy introduction here. A glance through the pages of any of the English popular magazines of the last quarter of the 19th century, Blackwood's, The Windsor, The Strand, or Pall Mall, shows that the scientific romance existed in a distinct form some years before 1895, when H.G. Wells' serial The Time Traveller, later in book form The Time Machine, was running in the pages of the New Review. The Marvel tale, astonishing journeys on incredible vehicles over and beyond the Earth and with minimal human interest, was also thoroughly established, with Jules Verne as its best known, though by no means sole, exponent. It would take a more careful reading of these magazines, however, to discover that the stories were by no means alike, either in quality, technique, or intention. If the traditional Marvel tale is set aside altogether, the remaining stories seem to me to fall into three or more less distinct types. The chief examples of these types which I have chosen for Volume 1 of this collection are The Battle of Dorking by G.T. Chesney from Blackwood's 1871 and The Great War in England of 1897 by William Le Queux, originally The Poisoned Bullet in Answers 1893. When William Came by H. H. Munro, or Saki, published by John Lane in 1913, a fine example of the third type will appear in Volume 2. These stories have basic premises and subject matter in common, the conquest of England by a foreign power, but are markedly different in emphasis and literary intention. Most critics of prophetic and imaginative literature, loosely described nowadays as science fiction, have tended to discuss stories entirely in terms of their basic subject matter, which enables them to yoke together different books, otherwise quite dissimilar. For example, two bizarre bedfellows might be E. M. Forster and Vargo Statten, the pseudonymous writer of scores of shilling novelettes published in the years immediately after World War II, sharing a chapter because they both wrote future city stories. And it's true that plot comparison of The Machine Stops and one of Mr. Statten's, they usually had titles like The Cosmic Conqueror, would make them seem virtually identical. Because they have all written interplanetary fiction, we find Jules Verne, John Cowper Powys, Naomi Jacobson, Edgar Wallace, and Isaac Asimov blithely lumped together, although their literary intentions and methods have nothing in common. Critics might just as well be comparing R.S. Surtees, Thomas Hardy, George Borrow, Dorothy Sayers, and P.G. Wodehouse because they all wrote novels with English rural backgrounds. Such critics, and unfortunately they are often the ones to whom the confused reader turns to help in selecting the best books published today as science fiction, only perpetuate confusion. I suspect that they, like Kingsley Amis, receive little pleasure from the novel of character. Neither do they seem intelligent enough to distinguish easily between social satire, the moral novel, or the good old-fashioned allegory. This sort of muddy thinking seems to permeate all English criticism nowadays. The critic's response is almost entirely to an author's subject matter, not to his manner of writing. The more familiar the subject matter, the more at ease the critic feels, and so the more he praises the author. This state of affairs has accelerated the current decadence of English prose and led to the astonishing elevation of extremely poor writers like Virginia Woolf or John Braine. So at the moment we're in the amusing situation where genre SF critics complain when a book is not written according to the accepted SF conventions. In the sort of criticism I have described, it is rare to find any discussion, however naive, of the quality of an author's writing, and I have seen quite well-known critics unthinkingly quoting excruciating prose in an attempt to make a case for a writer they admire. Some of my own worst writing has been used, more than once, in this way. Now, I don't consider myself a critic, but I do nevertheless feel a bit judged. Anyway, for this conversation, I welcome all new guest, co-host Liam Jones to the Roof Garden. Liam is a Moorcockophile and lover of Victoriana and invasion fiction, so is an ideal foil for this episode. At some point we may get round to looking at the second volume of these tales, England Invaded, but for now, pop down and grab a copy of The Strand, retreat to your parlour, pour a large glass of Madeira, get your feet up, and join us as we journey back to the late 19th century, to the time before Armageddon. We're back at Derry Toms, and this time I have first-time guest and co-host Liam Jones with me. Liam, actor, occasional radio presenter, all-round raconteur. Welcome to Derry Toms.
Nice to be here.
This has actually been quite a while in the making because we tried to do this last year, and due to my terrible scheduling and need to cancel on a couple of occasions, we never got around to it. But you know what? We got here eventually for episode 90. Believe it or not, of Breakfast in the Ruins. Now, of course, it's your first time in Derry Toms, so I've got to ask the perennial question that all new guests get asked. Why Moorcock, and what is your background with genre fiction and this kind of guff that we talk about?
Well, I've got quite a new, I think probably a bit different from a lot of people. I've noticed from past listens, a lot of people seem to have been introduced through to Moorcock through childhood or through family members, like somebody had, like a grandfather or a father had it in their book collection. Like, I didn't have any of that. My dad never read Moorcock. He read a little bit of science fiction, but he never read the major stuff. He never read, like, for him, science fiction was often Star Wars is kind of where it was for him.
Yeah.
So that was the background I sort of came from. But my dad was pretty well read himself, but he was more non-fiction. But I think how I got introduced to Moorcock, when I was a lot younger, when I was probably a teenager, they used to have a lot of the science fiction magazines, SFX, things like that. Was it Sci-Fi Now? I think another one was.
Yep, that's right. Yeah.
And I think it was one that existed very briefly called Death Ray. I think.
Oh.
Didn't last long. I think it lasted about 3-4 years. I think, and then folded. And I would just keep seeing this name cropping up all the time in all the book sections. You'd always see Michael Moorcock, and I keep going, well, this guy's probably a bit of a big deal if he keeps turning up everywhere. In fact, there's a book I've got on the bookshelf here, which I bought in Hay-on-Wye when I was very, very young, because I was one of those kids who really liked science fiction. I was kind of pretty awful for getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning to watch the Doctor Who reruns on UK Gold.
Yep.
So I can't believe I could actually get up at those ungodly hours at one point now without complaint. But I was actually watching Doctor Who way before the revival had happened, so a lot of people who I was in school with, I was like the one kid watching Doctor Who, and everyone would just go, what the hell is he talking about? I was watching some stuffy old programme from the 70s is what they sort of saw it as. But in the book, they had a still from the final programme, the film version.
Ah.
And I think that might be the first exposure to Moorcock I ever saw. And I just looked at that, I think at the time I looked at it, well, what the hell is that? Why is there this big inflatable pinball machine, and why is there, people in bubbles walking around?
Yeah.
And then I just sort of moved on, and I went through the book, I focused more on, like it's Judge Dredd, I'll read Judge Dredd's more where it's at. But then, once again, the name Moorcock just kept coming up. And eventually I just sort of thought, well, I'm going to have to look into whoever this guy is, because he's a big deal if he keeps turning up everywhere. So I would find out, and I read in one of the magazines, the first thing I read about him was actually... book-wise, was Behold the Man. So that was my proper introduction to Moorcock, which I've often recommended it to people as, if you want to get into Moorcock, I think that's quite a good introduction.
Absolutely.
Because it doesn't have any of, multiverse stuff and Eternal Champion things that might confuse a few people, I think, when they first get in there. I think it's a good standalone story. It's a quick read as well. You probably get through it in the afternoon if you're quick, if you have a decent read of it. And then I was like, okay, it's interesting. And then I got into the Elric stuff. In fact, over in the bookshelf here, I've got the original Elric run, which is a Panther editions.
Yeah,
I think the ones
1970s editions, yeah.
Yeah, they're the ones I've got. And yeah, I just started getting into that. I read Final Program. I haven't tackled the rest of the Cornelius books yet. Everyone's told me that they are, they get weird.
They do.
I've got a very close friend who... when he was young, he's a lot older than me, but when he was younger, he bought the original Cornelius Quartet as a collection because one of them had just won the Guardian Prize, I think. I think it might have been the Condition of Muzak.
It was, yeah.
And I think he said his first Moorcock he ever read was the Condition of Muzak. Which I thought that, from what I've gathered, that's proper going in at the deep end. That's
Yeah, I think
Moorcock
so.
on
I mean,
hard mode.
yeah, the funny thing about the Cornelius Quartet is you probably could read them in any order you want.
Yeah.
In terms of
There's no continuity,
chronology,
really, is there?
because there is no chronology or continuity. But in terms of difficulty level,
Oh, yeah.
if you were going to rate it, yeah,
Oh,
I think I don't know. I think it'd be a toss-up between Condition of Music and maybe The English Assassin. The problem is that I've got with the Cornelius Quartet is, other than the final program, which of course we did on here with Hussein, it's probably 25 years since I've read the others.
Yeah.
So a lot of the events of those other books probably all blur into each other. But I'm pretty sure it's The English Assassin where, for a large chunk of it, Jerry Cornelius is a seawater-soaked corpse screaming in a coffin or something. Yeah, it's been a while.
It's because the first novel is, final program. It's kind of just a weird spy novel, really.
It's like a spy racket.
Yeah,
retread
but
of
really
the Dreaming City
strange
and some
and
other
a bit,
things.
Yeah, it's a very It's a very not 60s. Well, it is 60s, but almost like the hippie take on the spy novel more than than Bond. It's very anti-Bond in that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then, as I've heard, it just goes completely off the rails quite quickly. Well, bear in mind where the original book ends is still pretty out there. Where the film ends is very, very out there.
Yeah,
I've had to try. I've explained that film to a few people, and as soon as I get to the hermaphroditic ape man who sounds like Humphrey Bogart, that's the bit where they just I think that's the bit where I lose them.
Yeah, I think if you judge that ending based upon the novel,
yes,
it comes across as a bit lame.
But it's got a charm to it, I think.
It does have a charm to it, and I think if you don't go in with expectations set by the novel that he will turn into a 14-foot-tall hermaphrodite who leads the population of Europe into the sea, budget-wise,
can't really do it. Yeah.
Probably a bit of a problem for Robert Fust on that occasion. But yeah, I like that ending.
It's got a lot of people who, because didn't Robert Fust didn't he work on the Avengers at some point?
He did, yeah.
Because it feels very Avengers at times. There's little bits of it.
Oh yeah.
Especially the house when they're in the house, there's like the chessboard and all that. All feels very, very Avengers. It's like a more, it's like a more sexed up version of the Avengers, I'd say.
Yeah, and Fust was a visual designer before he was a director of television and films as well.
Dr. Phibes films as well, didn't he?
He did, yeah.
Which I can definitely tell. You can tell he's a production designer just by looking at that.
Yeah, there's a real golden thread that runs through all of his work.
I love the look of those films. I think that's the one thing they all get down is that they're really interesting looking films, which you don't get much anymore. I think we don't have these unashamedly such stylized films very often.
No, and that's something which I think the final program film. The first time I ever came across that, I'd gone to Prague with Loz, and I was 21. So this is how long ago it was. You probably weren't born when I was 21, were you? You're a young whippersnapper, I think.
30 on Friday. So.
30 on Friday, yeah. So you look round about the year you were born. Fucking hell. Me and Loz went to Prague. I must have been talking to someone at work about my reading habits and the final program and stuff like that. And when we got back from Prague, this guy I worked with, Jim, said, "Oh, I taped the film of the final program off Bravo TV for you." In those days, there was a satellite channel called
I remember Bravo towards it.
Yeah.
They used to always do the top 100 countdowns of horror films and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That's
So I went, well, it can't be the same thing. Because, of course, before the days of internet and understanding these things, and I never really read things like Starburst or anything like that when I was in my teens and 20s, back in the late 80s and early 90s. So I didn't think it'd be the same thing, but anyway, I gave him the tape and I took it home. And I watched it for the first time, recorded on a VHS cassette off Bravo, not in widescreen, but then again, it's 1.85 to 1 anyway, so a pan and scan version of it, in inverted commas, wasn't really necessarily such a bad thing anyway. And I was kind of baffled by it, and particularly disappointed with the ending, but there were so many things I loved about it that I probably watched it a few times, and then, you get rid of your VHS player. I think I ended up buying the Anchor Bay Region 1 DVD.
Which I think that's out of print now, is it?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, probably long.
And for years, that was the only way you could get it. The Network DVD did an edition of it.
Of course. I always see it in the same bracket as stuff like Zardoz.
Yeah.
In that weird sort of period as pre-Star Wars science fiction where there's still that weird hangover of the 60s is going on.
Oh, yeah.
It's all a bit weird, cynical, and a lot of times not very good. They're not very good films, but you kind of go, I think to myself, I'd rather watch like an interesting failure than something which is, competent but boring.
You know what? Give me interesting failures every day of the week over
because
90% of the guff that gets churned out now.
Yeah, I've watched too many things which are competently made, but I go, I'm immediately going to forget about that. But Zardoz, I'm going to remember that for the rest of my life. And Zardoz is not a film I'm going to forget in a hurry.
No, Zardoz is a film that I've got on the back burner to actually talk about on this podcast because I got the John Barman novelisation.
It does fit
well.
Very much in that era. Like, I did a podcast for a friend very, very, very long time ago, and we did a trilogy of about folk horror films.
Mm.
And somebody else in there, a guy called, I can never remember his name, but he came up with a really good term for the 70s, especially that horror and science fiction scene in the early 70s. He says the 70s to him is the hangover from the 60s.
Mm.
So all of like the peace, love, and their hippiness of the 60s comes crashing down, and the early 70s is much more cynical, a lot more dark, gritty, just a bit grimier.
Absolutely. All that bitter vitriol that they all pushed down into the pit of the stomachs and turned into a black ball of bile through the 60s all came out in the 70s. Probably started a little bit earlier than that. I mean, if you look at a film like Performance, it really starts wringing out of the pores of that film.
That's a film that feels like it almost actively hates hippies.
Yeah.
Like it actively seems to hate the hippie movement.
Outside of the final programme, I think when you think of some of the more cynical turns that Moorcock has taken in stories like the stories that comprise my experiences in the Third World War and things like that, had he written a final programme type story, or maybe not a final programme, had he written a Ladbroke Grove story that had been much more informed by the darker tones that he employed in my experiences in the Third World War, rather than the more kind of optimistic, we're all getting smashed together at a Hawkwind gig kind of tones, I think he would have turned something like Performance out in all
Well, you see, Hawkwind, I think, are the perfect example of that, because you see the first album, they're doing stuff like, Hurry On Sundown, which is like a great sort of like campfire hippie song, really.
Yeah.
And then a couple of years later, they're doing songs like Urban Guerrilla, where they're literally advocating for terrorism in it.
Yeah.
I think if any band sums up the shift in the hippie mindset, I think. Like, the hippies go militant in the 70s, they join, things like the Angry Brigade and all that kind of stuff's going on. And I also find that as a really interesting period to look at, especially for film.
When you go from that Eel Pie Island period, where everything, the hippies had this wonderfully utopic view of what it was to be a hippie and music and dance and drugs. Oh, I bet there's some horrific...
Oh, yeah. Oh, God, yeah.
Like, under the floorboard stories of that whole Eel Pie Island movement and everything that came afterwards. There'll be some real horror stories about that, Oh,
God, I can imagine. I can only begin to imagine. But yeah, that's kind of where I got to Moorcock, in a roundabout way. Just sort of followed the breadcrumbs for years, and eventually there he was.
Yeah.
And he was kind of my gateway into the sort of new wave era of science fiction. So he actually got me into Ballard for a start. He's the one who actually got me interested in Ballard, which I found quite interesting, even though technically, of the pair of them, Ballard's probably the more well-known writer as a mainstream writer.
Yeah, it's a funny thing about Moorcock, isn't it? Because whilst he won things like the Guardian Fiction Prize and Motherland and was, I think, shortlisted for the Whitbread Prize or the Booker Prize, whatever it was, and I think whilst he has always had some kind of presence in publications like The Guardian, and even today, he's still writing odd articles here and there for New Statesman. He's never really been a critical darling like the types that even Aldous and Ballard have been. Is because I think because he's always indelibly connected with hippies and speed freaks and sweaty people.
Yeah,
the mainstream establishment doesn't like.
He's still quite countercultural in a way. I always find the popularity of Alan Moore kind of feels like it's the trade-off in a way, that they kind of went, we've kind of accepted Alan Moore now because maybe we didn't accept Moorcock as quickly as we should have beforehand.
Yeah, that's a funny...
Because I know they're quite friendly with each other as well, aren't they? I think they've got quite a good... But I always consider them quite similar figures in some respects, in terms especially influence on their respective mediums and genres.
And I think they've had similar experiences with other kind of younger artists
Yes.
as well, who've come along and dined out on perhaps their influences.
I know they both hate Grant Morrison, so...
Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah, yeah, very much so. Well, funnily enough, we're not actually talking purely about a Moorcock story today,
No.
are we?
He's more curator on
we
this.
decided when we had this conversation last year, I think it was I hope it wasn't the year before, I'm sure
No, it was last year. It was probably
Yeah.
about May, I think.
Yeah.
Possibly.
We decided that we would take a look, for one reason or another. Well, there is a reason we decided to take a look at this, because you've got a specific interest in invasion literature.
Yes, I do.
Victorian invasion literature, which you can tell me about in a moment. But we decided to cover Before Armageddon. Now, yeah, I've got my
Star edition, mine is.
I've got my hardcover copy here, and I have got my Star edition with the
lovely airship, the French and British airship, which I love the designs on them.
It's a beautiful cover, but I don't think there are any airships in any story.
There is a
in
story about a British and French submarine fighting each other.
Yeah,
but I think they decided.
But no airships.
What's more Victorian science fiction now than airships?
Yeah, I mean, and also some of the authors did write kind of steampunky airship fiction.
Yep. Oh, yeah, well, one fella in it. It's what was his name? George Griffith.
Griffith, yeah.
Who wrote I think it's the Voyage
Angel of the Revolution,
yeah,
didn't he?
The Avenger, I think it's yes.
He wrote Angel of the Revolution.
Yes, which is it's the classic air pirate story, which is I find quite interesting because it's one of the first, I dare say, probably one of the first works of literature which is sympathetic to anarchism as well, especially around at that time where it would have been a very controversial statement to say if you sympathised at all with sort of like a revolutionary movement.
We'll talk about George Griffith a little bit when we get to his story. But
yes.
Before we crack on, I was wondering what I could possibly drink that would be thematically appropriate
go on.
for Before Armageddon. And it's a bit lame, to be honest. I had a really nice bottle of Madeira on the shelf, and I did have a look. So I was like, right, what were people drinking all the time that wasn't beer? And really, the predominantly popular drinks in gentlemen's clubs and places like that were the usual things, gin, but also Madeira, because Madeira travelled well.
Okay.
So when it came to, brigadier generals who were going backwards and forwards from India into various different places, Madeira, because it was high alcohol content, travelled really well, and even in high temperature, all that business. I've had a bottle of Madeira on the shelf for about 10 years that I haven't touched. So I went to have a look for it earlier on, and I couldn't find it. So Madeira denied. So instead, I'm breaking my own rule, really, which is I'm just going to drink IPA.
Well, that's quite interesting because I wish I had a bottle of it with me, but unfortunately, the local brewery, their bottle shop is closed at the moment.
Oh,
they're refurbishing the place, and they've got a beer called Afghan, which is named after the Indian pale ales used to have to travel through, things like the Khyber Pass.
Kush. Yeah.
So I thought, well, that would have been the perfect one for stories about the British Empire and things.
Yeah, that's why I thought IPAs, maybe might give. I mean, let's not forget that modern IPAs are all dry hopped and mostly unpleasant, and I've got a bit bored of them. But some of the original classic IPAs are actually just high alcohol content pale ales at the end of the day, because once again, it travels well and it doesn't spoil as quickly.
Here is very nice actually, but it's more powerful than the label suggests, I think.
Yeah. So, do you have any libations which you are digging into this evening?
I've got this bottle. I've just got a Belgian beer.
Oh, very nice.
A cherry beer.
Is it Creek Boone?
Creeken beer. It's Bacchus.
Bacchus. Yeah, I saw the shape of the bottle. Now, Phil doesn't like beer. Oh, she says she doesn't like beer, but actually she's a liar. She does like beer.
Right.
She only likes really expensive Belgian fruit lambics. So only yesterday, was it yesterday? Yeah, only yesterday she was drinking Creek Boone.
Okay.
Yeah, which is her current favourite. I, on the other hand, have got a Verdant Brewing Company There Was No Why DI IPA, 8% volume. It was something stupid like £6.95 for a can, which kind of turns my stomach slightly.
Yeah.
And I have dipped into my little bag of 5 stupid IPAs, and this is the one that came out. So I'm going to go with this. So why your big interest in invasion literature?
Well, I found it interesting because I sort of stumbled on it via War of the Worlds, which I think is the obvious entry point in it. Because it probably is the most famous example of an invasion novel. It's the one that sort of eclipses all the other ones. But I just found it interesting that this was a huge phase in the 19th century, probably to the... I would say it peaks in the late 19th century and sort of continues into the 1910s and into the 20s. But I find it interesting because I think it sums up a lot about the people of the time, but also politics of the day as well, what people's paranoia is, what people frightened of.
Yeah.
Like, I've noticed, looking through some of the stories in this, particularly you got the Battle of Dorking, and is it the Great War of 18... Is it the Great War of 1896?
Great War in England of 1897.
That's the one, yeah. But it's interesting because you get to see who's the enemy of the weak.
Yeah.
Like, who are we afraid of most at that very moment? So we write a story about them coming over to invade us. In fact, I find it very funny that the Great War in England, there's another book that came out after it by the same writer called The Great War in England in 1910.
Yeah.
Where's the Germans instead?
The Great Invasion.
Yes, the Great Invasion.
Invasion of 1910.
And now he's going, the Germans are going to invade. Because he's realised the French and Russians are on our side now, so we best not annoy them.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? And I think what we've got in here as well is we've got two examples which in some ways are polar opposites.
Yes.
But we'll talk about why. But first of all, I just want to read the introduction to the introduction. It's a quote from H.G. Wells in a letter to Rebecca West from H.G. Wells and Rebecca West, 1974. So it says, I'm almost unendurably lonely and miserable. I've got tired, I've done no end of work and good work. I've really changed British policy about Russia, and when I sit in judgment on myself, I smother myself with wreaths. The outline of history is going to change history. I've done good things and big things. It doesn't matter a damn so far as my wretchedness is concerned. Righteous self-applause is not happiness. And it seems surely quite fitting, and it's an intriguing taste of the kind of barren, bleak and disturbing themes that sit at the heart of some of these stories. Because Wells was fascinated with Russia, and Russia does get a wee look in as one of the enemies of the week.
Yes.
But his science fiction stories were massively popular in Russia. And he was hugely read, even by senior people.
I think Stalin was a big fan of it. I know they met each other at one point.
They did, and not only that, but Wells had numerous visits, and over the years he interviewed Lenin, Gorky, and Stalin in 1935. And there's a transcript of his meeting with Stalin on the New Statesman website. And it's absolutely fascinating, particularly when Wells points out that he's probably politically to the left of Stalin. This is 1935, by the way, so, the purges are probably taking place, but we're not really in the West particularly aware of the level to which Stalin is doing what he's doing. I mean, there's a lot of context behind the statement, but it is well worth a read.
I need to check that for a long time. Yeah,
it's a really interesting article because it shows not only how well-informed Stalin was about Wells, but also about Wells's politics before they actually meet. And the back and forth is, if you didn't know what Stalin did, and you didn't know what he'd be guilty of, it reads like two extremely erudite gentlemen talking about their own specific angles on socialism, Bolshevism, the problems with the bourgeoisie, the problems with industry, the problems with capitalism, how to address those problems. You definitely do get the sense that Stalin is the authoritarian end of the scale from that interview. But it is a really fascinating read. But it's also intriguing that, like, in the tales of this book, despite being written in the 1870s, certainly the Battle of Dorking, there's this strange combination of faith in the empire clashing with paranoia about an overwhelming force invading Blighty, because two of the big stories, the two longest stories are invasion literature. We get the 20th century bogeymen of continental politics in a rampant Germany overrunning Europe in Battle of Dorking, which is quite prescient. Well, at the time, considering it was written in the 1870s.
It was just after the Franco-Prussian War. Had happened. Germany had literally just become a country, and they were being seen as, the French were the big empire in Europe at that, they were the big power of Europe, and suddenly, they've been unseated from it.
Yeah.
And before then, the French were the number one bad guys before then.
Yeah, the other one, the Great War in England, 1897, which I think was written in 1892. Then the baddies in that are the French in partnership with the Russians, and it's the Kaiser who rides in to the rescue towards the end to rescue the noble British and rescue the Empire.
Such an odd story. It's in hindsight, it's very weird to read.
Yeah, and I really like the Battle of Dorking. The Great War in England 1897 is interesting, but I think it's largely rubbish.
It's more of it's a bit of curiosity.
Yeah,
I think what
yeah.
makes the Battle of Dorking, I think, a better story, even though it's written by a military officer. It actually, is it George Chesney? I think it is.
Yeah, G.T. Chesney, yeah.
G.T. Chesney, yeah. He was an actual military officer.
He was.
And
yeah.
he wrote it as a sort of warning to Britain about demilitarization. If we demilitarize, they're going to come over here and walk all over us.
Yeah.
And what I find it's interesting, I think it's a better story, is that element of, even though it does come from a place of sort of jingoism and patriotism, it's still quite a bleak story. It doesn't seem to have that much saber rattling. It does feel quite, in a way, feels a bit like War of the Worlds in that respect. Of it's a hopeless situation.
Yeah, you can tell that Wells was massively influenced by the Battle of Dorking. Because apparently, Battle of Dorking was hugely influential.
Oh yeah,
and basically kicked off invasion literature, and it was copied multiple times by multiple different people for all the magazines like The Strand and Hampstead and all these different magazines. But when you actually read it, the language is, we're reading it 150 odd years after it was written. The language, like reading War of the Worlds, which is one of the most striking things about reading War of the Worlds, the language is surprisingly contemporary. It's direct. The prose is really functional, really readable. It establishes tension really, really successfully. Because it's written from the perspective, like War of the Worlds is, it's a future account, in this case from 50 years after the battle, a recollection essentially from an old man communicating with his grandchildren who, we find towards the end, are abandoning Great Britain due to the terrible conditions following 50 years of occupation and the dismantling of the British state by the dastardly German invaders. I'm gonna read a little bit of it. Let's have a look. So it kicks off. It says, "A glance through the pages of any of the English popular magazines of the last quarter." Oh no, that's the introduction. Silly bastard. Right, let me find the right page. Battle of Dorking. Here we go. I know this IPA is 8%, but it's a bit early to be losing my marbles right now. Here we go. "You asked me to tell you, my grandchildren, something about my own share in the great events that happened 50 years ago. 'Tis sad work." Okay, there is a bit of...
That's a bit Victorian, but...
bit archaic works. "'Tis sad work, turning back to that bitter page in our history, but you may perhaps take profit in your new homes from the lesson it teaches. For us in England it came too late, and yet we had plenty of warnings, if we had only made use of them. The danger did not come on us unawares. It burst on us suddenly, 'tis true, but its coming was foreshadowed plainly enough to open our eyes. If we had not been wilfully blind, we English have only ourselves to blame for the humiliation which we have brought on the land. Venerable old age, dishonourable old age, I say, when it follows a manhood dishonoured as ours has been. I declare even now, though 50 years have passed, I can hardly look a young man in the face when I think I am one of those in whose youth happened this degradation of old England, one of those who betrayed the trust handed down to us unstained by our forefathers. What a proud and happy country was this 50 years ago. Free trade had been working for more than a quarter of a century, and there seemed to be no end to the riches it was bringing us. London was growing bigger and bigger. You could not build houses fast enough for the rich people who wanted to live in them, the merchants who made the money and came from all parts of the world to settle there, and the lawyers and doctors and engineers and others and traders people who got their share out of the profits. The streets reached down to Croydon and Wimbledon, which my father could remember quite country places. And people used to say that Kingston and Reigate would soon be joined to London. We thought we could go on building and multiplying forever. 'Tis true that even then there was no lack of poverty. The people who had no money went on increasing as fast as the rich, and pauperism was already beginning to be a difficulty. But if the rates were high, there was plenty of money to pay them with, and as for what were called the middle classes, there really seemed no limit to their increase and prosperity. People in those days thought it quite a matter of course to bring a dozen children into the world, or, as it used to be said, Providence sent them that number of babies, and if they couldn't always marry on all the daughters, they used to manage to provide for the sons, for those were new openings to be found in all the professions, or in the government offices, which went on steadily getting larger. Besides, in those young days, men could be sent out to India, or into the army or navy, and even then emigration was not uncommon, although not the regular custom it is now. Schoolmasters, like all other professional classes, drove a capital trade. They did not teach very much, to be sure, but new schools with their 400 or 500 boys were springing up all over the country. What fools we were. I think that's a really excellent opening, and it's very, very like the opening of War of the Worlds, just made slightly less arcane.
Listening to that just then, I think I could imagine Richard Burton doing the narration for about. if Jeff Wayne had made a Battle of Dorking concept album back in the day.
Yeah. Yeah. The funniest thing about that, because it was written 150 years ago, if you gloss over the bit about sending young men to India, you could read that and with very little alteration apply to someone today yearning for the happier, more prosperous days of Britain in 2008.
Oh, definitely. It's very strange.
Yeah. And, as we've noted, big influence on Wells. You can tell just from the style and form of the narrative, and not just because it's a reflective account from a guy who experienced it firsthand. The pace is high. There's no hanging around. There's no unnecessary exposition. Not a word really is wasted. And it establishes that sense and feel for late 19th century Britain that feels really authentic and vital. And what is the story essentially about? Yeah. It's about a guy who is middle class, he works in an office, but he joins the draft to join a militia, and then we get numerous accounts. We don't really get to action until probably 2/3 of the way through. It's numerous accounts of how they have to try and get trains to assemble, how there's not enough rifles to go around, how there's not enough food. When they do get food, there are no pots and pans. The logistics are terrible. The Army Logistic Corps is non-existent. The officers are mostly incompetent. When they come across regular soldiers, the regular soldiers stare through them with a 1,000-yard stare and say, it'd be better if you weren't even here, just leave it to us. The militias and volunteers are so useless. And he was a soldier, of course, as you mentioned, and his account of forming the militias and all of the lack of organisation and logistics that dog the narrator and the other volunteers before they get the first taste of combat, which is fairly brutal, and the defeat, it all feels really, really super authentic.
Oh, yeah. It's obvious, one of those things you can clearly tell it's written by somebody who was in the forces, which I think you can always tell that when anyone's actually been in the armed forces. It does show in the writings. When you see actors as well who've then X-Forces, you can always see that in their performances. Yeah. Like you watch the guys in there, remember in Doctor Who when you have the unit boys and all that.
Yeah.
You could clearly tell.
The Havoc stunt team.
Yeah, weren't a lot of them X-Forces as well?
Yeah.
I think, and they seem authentic, the way they carry themselves, the way they act. They seem to know all the little things that need to be, they need to do to give it a bit more authenticity. Which goes a long way.
I'm pretty sure the guy who played Benton had done national service. Of course, they're being made where pretty much everybody who was of a certain age who was a man probably did national service for 2 years. Yeah. And the Havoc stunt team, well, that's one thing modern Doctor Who needs to bring back. Reform the Havoc stunt team.
Yeah, because I always find with New Who's version of Unit, I always find them a bit boring, if I'm honest.
They're a bit boring, and they look like they've got all their uniforms and kit from a paintball.
Yeah. Why don't? If they're supposed to be a military unit, why aren't they actually in uniform, actual proper.
Yeah. They always look like paintballers who want to go, yeah, we're authentic, man. Yeah.
The most insufferable person,
Yeah, doesn't really work for me at all.
No, I've never liked the new design for them, to be honest. It's just, they look too SWAT to me, I think.
Yeah, they do.
They should look more army. They should actually look like soldiers.
Yeah,
I'm saying that, I think they sort of peaked in the 70s as a look.
Yeah, well, don't get me down the track of talking about why modern Who should be more like old Who to satisfy old farts like me.
I know.
Yeah.
We'll be here forever. Yeah. That's another podcast.
Yeah, well, I think we've already done 2 talking about Doctor Who with Miles, and we've got another one coming. Because we've tried to get through Coming to the Terror Files. I think we've done 4 hours so far and still not finished it.
I'm friends with a writer who wrote one of those Doctor Who novels from around about that time. Alistair Reynolds? Yes, he's a friend of mine over the last few months.
Ah,
he ended up doing a show with us earlier in the year, so...
Oh, right, cool.
Yeah, we connected through that, and it's been quite fun, And he was telling me about his Doctor Who novel. You think he specifically requested, could I make it a unit novel?
Oh, very good. Well, if at any point we ever get around to doing any more Doctor Who, then I think you and your friend need to be on the couch.
Oh, yeah, I'll have to guess if I can rope him in at some point.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. Yeah, so Battle of Dorking, I think it's really, really effective. He describes the build-up to combat. Once the combat starts, it doesn't really go particularly according to plan, certainly from the Empire's perspective. It weakens slightly at the end when the impact of the defeat just comes across as, it's rubbish under the yoke of our conquerors, innit? And falls slightly into, we're no longer British and therefore ace, and nothing can vaguely compare to that, so we're crap now. That last page and a half, you don't really get a sense for what the 50 years of occupation meant, other than they've stopped us being British.
Yeah, is there what have they done to stop them feeling British? Has there been a mass, Germanisation campaign or something? Has there been some sort of, what have they done? What's happened in the 50 years? And I
you don't really get a sense for it, and that's the point where it gets most jingoistic. It's like, we can no longer be British, therefore we're only half a person.
It's a missed opportunity, I think. Which I don't know why he didn't take the chance to, to a little bit of world building in there of what does post-invasion Britain look like, what is the world, other than just, woe is me, we're not British anymore.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I think he was writing to an agenda, wasn't he?
Oh, God, certainly.
He was very much writing to an agenda, which is our army needs reform, otherwise we're going to get turned over.
Oh, yeah.
Because essentially he's a reformist.
Look what's happened to France.
Yeah, along the way, there's a really great sequence that we've not mentioned, which is the section where the available flotilla of the Royal Navy, because there's a description how the Royal Navy, despite being the most powerful fleet in the world, a big chunk of it is out trying to protect Canada. A big chunk of it is out trying to protect commerce around India. And all they've got left is dispatched to meet the invading fleet. And everything goes horribly wrong. But the narrator and his comrades' only source of information, it all takes place over the source of about maybe a paragraph or two, is a time-lapsed and short series of updates that they get from daily newspaper updates, new editions. And it's just a short series of updates that indicate a horrific and total defeat of the fleet, which absolutely demoralises the country. It is so effective.
It's simple. It's a very simple thing to do. I like things where some of the action does happen completely, off the page, and we're just getting the snippets of it.
Yeah, it's great because all of that information is just purely what he and his fellow militia members are picking up.
Yeah.
Bit by bit, either from a guy who rolls in with a wagon from town with a few kettles, or from somebody who manages to bring a newspaper down from the railway station. And so you get exactly the same series of updates on how horrifically everything is going as they do, until the firing starts and the artillery starts and they all start getting blown to bits and shot in the head and everything else that goes on. Yeah, it's really, really effective. And he did write more, but he didn't write a whole lot more. And I think one of the most interesting things about him is he was an experienced officer in the Royal Engineers and survived brutal engagements. He was at the Siege of Delhi.
Oh, right, yeah.
Which was pretty brutal, which was, that followed a mutiny of Indian soldiers who were
during the 1857...
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, rebellion.
And so they rebelled against some really harsh humiliation and brutal treatment of a number of their comrades. So the siege by the British was 6 days long. It was brutal. It's characterised by merciless behaviour and a lot of incompetence and confusion from British commanders. That definitely informs this story, as Chesney is not at all shy to describe how fractured and flawed logistics and command can very, very quickly become.
You could probably tell, probably guessing, but he's probably got a few of his colleagues in mind. With some of the office, when he's writing officers, I think he's got a few people in mind.
Yeah, he's exercising some frustrations.
Oh, yes.
As he writes this story. I think the most fascinating thing about him, and how progressive can you say any senior officer who served in India in Victoria's empire could have been, but having served in India with Commonwealth troops, he went on to be a reformer in the 1880s and a senior member of what they called the Governor General's Council.
Yes.
And had he managed to overturn the prejudice and objections of the commander-in-chief of the Indian Army under the British, who believed that only the, inverted commas, governing race should have this privilege, he would have successfully brought in the policy of Indianisation, as it was called, in the army, and had Indian men admitted to the senior British officer corps.
Yeah, so they could actually be equal to British officers.
That's right. So he tried to get that through, but it was just objected to by the commander-in-chief of the Indian Army. And after leaving the army, he became a Tory MP. Yeah.
I do find it weird when you read about the Tories of the 19th century.
Yeah.
And some of them you read, some of the Tory MPs from back then, they're more progressive than some of the Tory MPs we've got now, which is very strange to read.
Well, I think at that time, there was really only the Tories and the Liberals.
Yes.
Wasn't there? There was no Labour Party.
No, Labour didn't exist yet. The Tories were about to turn into the Conservatives.
Yeah. Which
I think that was if I remember correctly, I think that was like an amalgamation of parties or something. You had the Whigs as well for a bit, and then the Liberals took over from the Whigs.
So you get the sense that the Tories and the Liberals were all just posh blokes with big sideburns who had minor disagreements on certain elements of policy, but were all still largely...
How horrible are we to the colonies? Liberals probably saying maybe we should be slightly nicer to them, and Tories going, no, we should be shooting more of them.
So Chesney did write some of the novels too, but they're They've not stayed readily available.
No.
And even if you try and find them online in ebook or scanned form,
Yeah.
it's pretty hard work.
I think
it's pretty hard work.
He seems to be very much it's kind of is like a one novel wonder in a way. I think it was one of those cases of he just hit the right point at the right time.
Yeah.
I think Battle of Dorking was such a perfectly timed story.
Absolutely, and it had a massive impact.
It became it was a phenomenon, really. It's probably one of the early examples we could probably talk of a novel becoming like a social phenomenon.
Yeah.
Like I read something, apparently there was a running joke at the time for Victorians to say if injuries they'd had to say, oh, it's an injury I had at the Battle of Dorking.
Oh, really?
Apparently that was like a sort of a running joke between Victorians for a while.
Yeah.
So that's how popular it was.
Yeah.
It became a point of reference for people. You could quote the Battle of Dorking to someone, and 9 times out of 10 they probably would have understood what you said. It's the equivalent of films that we quote all the time now or make reference to. So it's quite interesting. It was that much of a pop culture, it had that much pop culture impact, and that's probably why it's had much more staying power than anything else he's written.
Yeah, every era has its own cultural touchstones and that become part of the zeitgeist, doesn't it? And when you got all these magazines like, The Strand, for example, it's not long after that Sherlock Holmes stories start getting published in The Strand, and they become part of the cultural zeitgeist almost overnight and become hugely popular.
Well, this period of history, so the late Victorian era, is almost like a kind of a golden age for publishing, or at least for magazines. It's one of like the best periods for the popular press, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of The Strand, published in 1884.
Yes.
In The Strand, Jules Verne's Dr. Trifulgus.
Although that's apparently not its original name.
No, I forget the original name, but it was published a lot earlier in the original French.
I've got it here. It is called Fritflack.
Fritflack. I was thinking Zigzag, but that's a Rammstein song.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out if that translates to something from French, because it's such a bizarre title.
Yeah, you know what? It's a curious story, this one. It's essentially a weird tale, isn't it? What do you make of it?
It doesn't really fit in with the rest of the collection, I find.
This is one of the two stories, I think. This one and the Edith Nesbit one at the end seem like odd choices for this collection.
Yeah, they don't fit. All the other ones vaguely follow either invasion literature or a more speculative looking into the future. Like the last story is an essay. The last story isn't even a story, it's an essay.
There's what the Edith Nesbit one is the very last one, but it's just an article. It's just an article.
Which I think is great to include, which I think really, because I like seeing how the Victorians viewed the future, but less in actual fictional terms, just doing it as guessing, or guesswork.
Yeah, it's the Victorian equivalent of an episode of Tomorrow's World.
Yeah, and I love stuff like that. The French, there's loads of examples from French magazines. Apparently, the French were mad for speculating about what the future was going to look like. But speaking of French, it's an odd story because it's more weird fiction than.
It is, yeah. If I'd read it in one of those old... this might be before your time, but when I was a kid, for Christmas, I'd get something like the St. Michael 50 Tales of the Macabre.
I know the
collection.
Ones. I know
which would have a faux leather binding, but with a photo cover of, I don't know, a tarantula or something. Yeah. And it wouldn't be out of place in one of those. It could have been a short story in The King in Yellow, or an Algernon Blackwood collection. Yeah,
it feels much more comfortable next to those than it does in between. But what comes after it?
I think it's quite evocative and pleasing in terms of how it conveys a mood.
But it's strange when it's sandwiched between two invasion stories. It just feels...
It's also very short as well. It's only
very
pages,
short, yeah. It kind of goes by quite quickly.
Yeah. It's an interesting one, and I enjoyed it. There's something lyrical and whimsical about it.
What I like about Verne is a bit of a playfulness to Verne, I think, which I always find. And I always find it a bit disappointing that Verne doesn't seem to be held in as high regard in Britain as Wells. Yeah. Even though, in terms of influence, I think he is Wells' equal. Like, I know the French absolutely adore Verne, obviously, because... And he's got, he has got a very good claim to being one of the fathers of science fiction. And I've said, if without Verne, we wouldn't have Wells. I think, I don't think we would have ever had Wells without Verne, if he'd ever come on the scene.
It's in reference to Verne that as a school child, I first discovered that these things at the time weren't called science fiction, they were called scientific romances.
Yes, which I quite like as a term.
I do. I love it now. But when I was 12, I was like, romance?
Yeah.
What are you on about?
Yeah. But I like, once again, they are quite romantic stories. There is, even as dark as they can get, there's a bit of optimism to them. Like one of the first books I ever read actually was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I had my dad's old edition from when he was a child, which is... Now, I discovered not a well-translated edition, apparently.
I think I read that when I was like 12, because there was a series of books, and once again, we would get books for Christmas, and my sister would get Robinson Crusoe,
Yeah.
and it would be the same series of books by the
Yes.
same publisher. One sister would get Robinson Crusoe, one sister would get Heidi,
Yeah.
and I'd get The Three Musketeers or 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea or something like that. There might even have been abridged versions, but that's probably the last time I read any Jules Verne. I've not actually read any as an adult. I really should
read
correct
more from
that.
him. I think I need to read more from him. I've read the Rober stories as well. Is it Master of the World and Rober the Conqueror?
Right.
It's kind of him doing 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, but in the air.
Right. There's a film version
Vincent Price
of one of those.
played him, which is a great film. Very much recommend watching. It's a great bit of that 50s, 60s, and 70s proto-steampunk films that are going, like the Disney 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which is one of my, with James Mason, which is one of my all-time favourites. But
it's a cracker.
The version of Master of the World is interesting in that the heroes are the least likeable people in it. Like, the guy who's supposed to be the romantic lead is genuinely a horrible person.
Yeah.
Like, he's horrible to everyone in it.
The weird thing about the James Mason 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is I can remember watching that multiple times as a kid. And then when Alan Moore did The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, of course, having never read the novels...
No, I was
and not read Mysterious Island,
I know where you're going.
It's more explicit.
Yes.
The idea that Nemo was Sikh was a real kind of surprise to some people. And then you go back, it's never acknowledged in the James Mason one, but if you watch it now, especially if you watch it on Blu-ray in HD, he's very slightly browned up.
Yeah, I can't tell, is it makeup or is that just...
I think he's
how he
ever so slightly browned up to about the same degree Jeanette Goldstein is as Vasquez in Aliens.
No, I know exactly what you mean. It's not... It can go past you quite quickly, quite easily, I think. Yeah, I've only just noticed that. 'Cause at the time,
never noticed it as a kid, but of course, as a kid, you know, back in those days, we're not watching it on an HD TV. We're watching it on crappy pan and scan on a 240 line TV or something like that. It's only when you watch it donkeys years later, after being educated as to the actual nature of the character, that you rewatch it, and you go, holy shit!
And it's a wonderful performance. I think it is. Yeah. It's I think of all of the, obviously, I know around about that time Disney made loads of those live action adventure films. They made like Treasure Island at the time. I think they did Swiss Family Robinson around about the same time as well. They did. I think it's the best one they ever. I think it's the best live action thing they ever did. Yeah. Because in terms of production values, I think it's still one of the most incredible looking films ever. Like that.
Yeah. Kate Douglas is great in it as well.
Oh God,
is Peter Lorre in it as well?
Peter Lorre is Conceal here, the manservant for Professor Aronnax.
Yeah.
And he's wonderful because Peter Lorre is always good value for money.
Yeah.
And he just works. He's good for comic relief as well. I like the fact they got Peter Lorre not in a villain role for once.
Yeah.
I quite like seeing him as being the good guy in something.
Yeah.
Especially in his later years, where I think he's kind of graduated away from playing villains at that point, and he's sort of being a bit more. He becomes a bit more cuddly, I think. Yeah, I think he's not quite M anymore.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Our next story,
which
is the George Griffith story, The Raid of Laventia. Yeah. Before we get to that, I've drunk my stupid DD IPA. I'm going to jump onto a Volta Blood Orange and Rhubarb Sour. I'm not going to go into any detail. This is the only non-IPA in my bag, and I've pulled it out, so I'm going to have to have it. I'm not going to go into any detail on it, because as it happens, Phil and I went over to see Loz last weekend, and we actually did record a largely beer-focused podcast. Beer and stupid questions. Last time we recorded with Loz and we hadn't done any homework was the Christmas special last year, so I devised a really, really lazy quiz. So I couldn't pull the lazy quiz out of the hat again. Yeah. So instead, we just lined up 10 fucking stupid beers. And for each one, we had a topic of conversation. So that'll be going out as a Patreon extra at some point. So we'll talk about this Blood Orange and Rhubarb Sour. Spoiler, Loz poured half of his down the sink. But I actually quite liked it. But yes, The Raid of Laventia by George Griffith. So, who was George Griffith? This was published in 1901. So, journalist, apparently a utopian socialist.
In his youth,
if you believe what you read.
Came slightly more right-wing with age. Which, I'm not, an Edwardian man. Can't say I'm shocked.
Well, yeah. We mentioned earlier, his best-known work appears to be The Angel of the Revolution, A Tale of the Coming Terror.
Yes.
In 1893, the synopsis of which sounds very interesting to fans of Moorcock, particularly Warlord of the Air. The last publisher to publish it in print said it was a lurid mix of Jules Verne's futuristic air warfare fantasies and the utopian visions of News from Nowhere, and a precursor of Wells' future The War in the Air and the war invasion literature of George Tompkins Chesney and his imitators. It told the tale of a group of self-styled terrorists who conquer the world through airship warfare, led by a crippled, brilliant Jew and his daughter, the angel, Natasha. I need to read this book. Have you read it?
I've read it a while ago. I need to revisit it. But as I said, I find it interesting that it's a sympathetic treatment of, like, anarchist characters. Which I found, I'm wondering if that was because of circles he was travelling in at the time. Because I was wondering, obviously, you had people like William Morris as well was travelling within those sorts of circles as well. Yeah. And it's quite interesting to see a writer of that time writing about them as kind of as the heroes of the story. But in an anti-heroic way in some ways, but in a way where he's clearly quite sympathetic. He seems to be more on their side than he is with society in it.
Well, I'm glad to get it because we're going to be doing Warlord of the Air in late September. So I think I need to read this before.
It's definitely
but Moorcock talks at length about it in the intro.
Yes.
And part of it is in Volume 2 of this, England Invaded.
Yes.
But some more on that another time because we might come back and do England Invaded. But the Raid of La Vengeur, what did you make of this? You said it's your favourite.
I really like it. It might possibly because it's a bit of a leftover from my love for, like, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
Yeah.
Being a nautical science fiction story. And I like a good nautical story, and I like stories of the sea, I like a good submarine story. But I also find it interesting that there's this element of, there's like the arms race. Like super weapon, the fact that the British and the French are trying to build super weapons to fight each other.
Yeah, the dastardly French sending out essentially a privateer.
Yes, which I really like. I love the idea of a latter-day privateer as a concept. Yeah. I've always enjoyed the idea of these like anachronistic characters appearing outside of their own time. But what I found very interesting about it, which one of the reasons I liked it, which I think avoided it going into full-on jingoism, is that it actually does treat the French scientist as kind of a sympathetic character. Like
it doesn't make, until the very, very end, it doesn't make a massive differentiation morally.
No.
Between one side or the other.
They're doing the same thing. They're just, and even when he goes off in his rant about how much he hates the British, but he has a moment of nobility where he says, "Leave my men out of this."
I did laugh at that.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, just first point, I suppose, for me is, on one level, it's fascinating because it presages the impact that submarine warfare would have in the next big conflict. And Griffith has got a handle on this.
Yeah.
And he knows, so of course, World War I, the German U-boat menace is a horrific threat to Britain. And on the other hand, it gets wildly imaginative in some of the technical details.
How these submarines are used are fascinating. The way.
Yeah, because how does it work? The French one sends out
like
magnetic cable tendrils.
Yes, like tentacles
that
attached
sort of magnetically feel the water around it and sense.
It's
so it can attack from beneath ships and fire torpedoes upwards into them.
Which is a really interesting concept. I quite like it. I think it's
amazing.
It's classic steampunk there. It's classic mad science.
Yeah, whereas the British one, searchlights that work underwater.
Which feels very British to have it as the more... kind of the more boring of the two would be the British one, I think.
Yeah, the French one's a lot more romantic and interesting, isn't it?
It's almost like Wells versus Verne in that way, but Verne is going for the more over the top and a bit more wacky and weird. Well, Wells is a bit more austere and more practically minded with it.
Yeah, and this story is and has been retrospectively tagged as steampunk, and that makes sense. I think, unlike the Battle of Dorking, it's somewhat stuck in the past with its assertion that the arms race would take place between Britain and France. Because when was this published? 1901,
which feels quite late to the game at this point.
So I understand there was still a lot of tensions between Britain and France at that point
clearly
as well. But you mentioned the point where Flaubert realises that gig is up.
Yeah,
he's sunk the British cruiser. There's been no declaration of war. So he understands that if they get sunk, they're all dead. Yeah. Because the British submarine, have they mounted some of the technology on a warship called the Scorcher.
Yes.
So it's trapped in all of these headlights. The British somehow have got steerable torpedoes.
Yeah.
that are tracking it and heading it towards Portsmouth, heading the French submarine towards Portsmouth. And when Flaubert realises the gig is up, he's like, right, in order to save my men, I'm going to surface and take absolute responsibility for this. by this point, his lieutenant has fainted from the stress of it all. Which I thought was really, really sweet. He's fainted, and he's stood in the conning tower, which has got a big window.
Yes.
Where he's getting blinded by these underwater searchlights. And thinks, right, I'm going to surface. I'll tell them my crew were innocent. I just paid them. They were just here because they were paid to crew the ship. And then he shoots himself. So he says, they're all innocent, and shoots himself in the head. To no avail, because subsequently we found that the crew are tried as pirates and executed anyway. It's like, oh, mate. Oh, poor Flobber. Oh, it's such a shame.
It's darkly comic in a horrific sort of way, but I found myself really enjoying it. But I think it's probably the shortest story in the collection.
It is
one
short.
of them.
It is short. I don't think it's quite as short as the Jules Verne one.
No, but it doesn't waste its time or anything. It just does get into the action of it.
You know, it's a good, solid, speculative SF war tale.
Oh yeah, it's great, and I think if anyone's interested in steampunk, I think this is one I think has fallen through the cracks a bit.
Absolutely,
and I think I think people should rediscover this one because I think it's a lot of fun. It's just it's just kind of a good, almost a bit swashbuckling at times.
Yeah, the jingoism does just creep in on the last page, where we found that the British reverse engineer the L'avenger, build 30 more, but bigger and better. And the dastardly French have to concede that the Royal Navy is boss and get back in the box. The end. Take that, the French.
It's one of the things I find very funny about all these stories. There is an element of, it's the audacity of it. Sometimes there's elements of, oh God. It makes you think, I'm glad that Wells didn't do that with Wells. I really love, what's the one? Oh, God, the Disraeli comic.
Scarlet Traces.
I really like that. I think of all the ones that you've done humans reverse engineering the Martian stuff, it's the only one I think that gets it right.
I think Scarlet Traces is hands down the best of all the spin-off War of the Worlds fiction.
So I think
Nothing
I like
else
the idea
close.
that it depicts that if the humans do reverse engineer it, we end up becoming as bad as them.
Yeah.
We turn into... We continue what we were doing beforehand, just 10 times worse than we ever did before.
Yeah, I absolutely adore Scarlet Traces. And, you know, it's funny, since we did War of the Worlds with Alistair Thompson...
Yes, I really like that episode as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and we talked about the Stephen Baxter book, Massacre of Mankind.
Yes.
Well, since then, I've read another couple of things. I read a comic about the Thunderchild. I bumped into the guy behind it at Thought Bubble.
Okay.
Last year, the Comic Art Festival. And that's pretty good. I've only got volume 1. I think volume 2 of issue 2 was being kickstarted. I'm hoping to catch up with him in November at Thought Bubble again and maybe get issue 2.
Yes.
That was pretty good. And there's been another set of 3 novels done by, I think it's called Mark Hood.
Okay. Name sounds familiar.
Yeah, it's a trilogy of unofficial War of the Worlds sequels.
Yes.
That I really, really wanted to give a fair shake to and like, but the point at which in 1901 British sappers deploy, in inverted commas, claymores to bring down to bring down tripods, I was like, I'm out.
But you could, it's one of those things I sort of go, just do a quick Google search.
Yeah.
It's never been easier to find out.
Yeah, absolutely.
What the equivalent to it was at the time. Like, what was the equivalent to a claymore? Probably just dynamite or something.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's like, God bless you, Mark, but...
It takes you out of it completely.
It's like a claymore is... It's like saying... It's like in one of these stories, which we'll get to, the one about future technology.
Yes.
Where he talks about electroscoped cricket being beamed to a theatre, right?
Yeah.
It's like if someone had written that now, mimicking that article, it's the equivalent of saying that British sappers in 1901 used claymores is the equivalent of saying in that due to new technology, they were able to use a Sony camcorder to record the cricket so it could be beamed. Because claymore is a brand.
Yeah, it's just too specific of a thing. Yeah. It takes you out of it immediately. But I found with the various War of the Worlds spin-offs, I found one years ago. It was a short story collection, which I liked in premise. And the idea was, the War of the Worlds, but for the rest of the world. What the rest of the world up to?
I've got it. It's got one with Thomas Edison in it.
Yes. And there's one in there which...
And it's got one with the Texas Rangers
That's about to say that one. I like the premise of it, because I like a Western. I love a Western. And I thought the idea of Texas Rangers fighting the tripods, brilliant.
Yeah.
But then they win, and that really bothered me, because no, they wouldn't win.
Yeah, well, I don't know. Maybe they had Chuck Norris or something.
It just felt very jingoistic American in that way, don't mess with Texas sort of thing going. I was like, come on.
Speaking of jingoistic.
Oh, yes.
We come to the other biggie now, the second big example of invasion literature in this volume. The Great War in England in 1897.
Which I think
by William Le Queux.
Which is weird, knowing that he was part French.
Yeah.
He was born in France as well, I think.
Yeah. Published in 1894. This is the last section of a much longer book, which you kind of pick up on when there's a coda at the end that describes the fate of some people you've never heard of at any point while you're reading this. So most importantly, a villainous spy that seems random and out the blue if you've not read the
where's he come
book.
from?
Yeah. And this is entirely the polar opposite of the Battle of Dorking for me. I think it's a sensationalist shocker. And despite repeated references early on to British pluck and the bravery of London's defenders, London alternately being described as the world's capital or mistress of the world, and at one point citadel of the world, it soon devolves into quite a salacious descriptions of massacred civilians. There's one hilarious line where it talks about delicate ladies getting caught up in the press and trampled by the fleeing masses.
You can
Those
tell
poor delicate ladies.
This is such a this is like the exploitation version of the Battle of Dorking.
Is.
This feels like the Battle of Dorking came out. This was the exploitation rip-off that came out in its wake.
Yeah, it's the exploitation rip-off written by Giles Brandreth. Yeah.
It's such a... One thing that bugs me about the story, have you seen the illustrations from it?
No.
The original illustrations are wonderful. Like, there's fantastic illustrations of big battle scenes. Like, you've got a barricade and there's Russian soldiers climbing over it, fighting a group of red-coated British soldiers on the other end. You know, and it's wonderful Victorian illustrations, they're very inky, lots of lines, it's quite scratched. It looks lovely.
I think that would have really have helped the overall presentation.
Yes.
Because, to be honest, it is quite entertaining.
Oh, yeah. But much in that same way, a lot of those exploitation films are.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, if the death of grass is the exploitation...
I keep getting to get around to that after I heard you
nadir
talk
of 70s apocalyptic fiction. This is the death of grass of invasion literature, just with less sexual assault.
Well, believe me, there's some out there which are 10 times worse. Especially when it gets to... when it's the Chinese they start going after. That's when it reaches its worst.
Yeah, I think I'll avoid those.
Or they get bad.
So we've got population on the move trying to escape the dual powers of France and Russia. It's quite entertaining. Reads like a combination of jingoistic newspaper account and bloodthirsty penny dreadful at times. When you get there'll be discussions about... It'll basically go something like this. It'll be, the Russian cavaliers or the French Zouaves, who are the Algerians, attack the line. The defenders defend heroically and terrifically, but the warfare is terrible. That's used multiple times. The warfare is terrible. And then there will be a reference to dismembered corpses and dead horses. And so it's really bloodthirsty. It takes great pains to name check as many landmarks in London getting shelled into oblivion as possible. It's like plus reference to mangled bodies.
It's like if Roland Emmerich had done it.
It totally is,
had been a Victorian British writer, apparently.
Yeah, it really is. So Battle of Dorking is, the Pressburger version. This is the Roland Emmerich version.
Oh, God, it is. It's Victorian Independence Day.
Yeah.
That's what it feels like. It
entirely is. Even to the point where we really find... You find that the reason why they're being so successful is because somehow the dastardly French have developed advanced artillery techniques and shells. And that's what's given the invaders the upper hand. But once they run low on ammunition and a counterattack takes their ammunition trains, all of a sudden, British pluck, and I think the term British pluck is used about 4 times as well, recovers, and even the Empire gets in on the act. And there's a bit, right, where I go? I'm going to read a little bit where the soldiers of the Empire get stuck in. Okay, it says... The batteries on Streatham Hill, having been assaulted and taken, the force of defenders pushed quickly upwards to Upper Norwood, where our cavalry, sweeping along Westow Hill and Church Street fell upon the battery in front of the Crystal Palace. The enemy, owing to the interruption of their field telegraph, were unaware of their presence and were completely surprised. Nevertheless, French infantrymen rushed into the Crystal Palace Hotel and the White Swan, Stanton Harcourt, the Knoll, Rocklands, and other houses at both ends of the parade, and from the windows poured forth withering volleys from their levels. Our cavalry, riding down at the broad parade, used their sabres upon the artillerymen, and the whole of the French troops were quickly in a confused mass, unable to act with effect, and suffering appallingly from the steady fire of our volunteers, who very soon cleared the enemy from the White Swan, and, having been drawn up outside, poured forth a galling rifle fire right along the enemy's position. Suddenly there was a loud shouting, and the British ceasefire sounded. The French, though fighting hard, were falling back gradually down the hill towards Sydenham Station, when suddenly shots were heard, and turbaned cavalry came riding into them at a terrific pace from the rear. The British officers recognised the newcomers as a squadron of Bengal Lancers. At last, India had sent us help, and our men sent up a loud cheer. A large force of cavalry and infantry, together with 2 regiments of Gurkhas, had, it appeared, been landed at Sheerness. They had contemplated landing in Hampshire, but, more unfortunate than some of their compatriots who had effected a landing near Southampton, they were driven through the Straits of Dover by the enemy's cruisers. Marching north in company with a force from Chatham, they had earlier that morning attacked and routed the enemy's right flank at Blackheath, and after capturing the battery of the foes at Greenwich, the greater part of the escort of which had been sent over to Lewisham an hour before, they slaughtered a battalion of Zouaves and had then extended across to Denmark Hill, where a sanguinary struggle occurred. Lots of that. Lots of that going on.
It's the excessiveness of it. I find it's got a weird
reads
charm.
like a weird brochure
Yeah.
extolling the virtues of Commonwealth regiments in their association with specific streets and towns. It's really quite
it's the
amusing.
lack of restraint I kind of admire. The fact it just seems to be it's the very Victorian, classic Victorian morals of being quite prim and proper, but they love their violence, they love a bit of excess, they like to be shocked a bit, and I think it's it's the most Victorian story in the collection, I think.
Oh, and this is the most Victorian paragraph, right? Check this out. The fate of England, nay, of our vast British Empire, was in the hands of those of our stalwart sons of many races, who were now wielding valiantly the rifle and the sword. Through that blazing September day, while the people of London wailed among the ruins of their homes, and breathlessly anxious awaited news of their victory or their doom, the whole of East Kent, the southern portion of Surrey and northern Sussex, became one huge battlefield. Of the vast bodies of troops massed over hill and dale, every regiment became engaged. The butchery was awful. Oh, it's just... Empire, fuck yeah, coming around to save the motherfucking day, yeah.
What I love
amazing.
about it is that element of, that's so terrible, it's awful, let's watch.
It gets really repetitive. The battles are terrible. The carnage is bloody. The defenders fight valiantly and magnificently. French and Russian units are annihilated. From time to time, the author will randomly jump to long listings of units and their commanding officers for the best part of a page.
I was flicking
a whole
through
page of it.
I was flicking through it earlier, just before we started. I think the first page I came on to was just this little... I was just noticing it was just a long list of, I found one here, still onward. They rushed along the valley, great masses of French infantry, but the 1st, 2nd and 3rd Volunteer Battalions of the Royal Fusiliers under Colonel G.C. Clark, VD, Colonel A.L. Keller and Colonel L. Well, respectively, and the 2nd and VP Middlesex Regiment under Colonel G. It just goes on.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
There's one of them, it's almost a page long.
I think I stumbled on that one earlier, and it was the most... I was thinking, are you serious?
14th Sussex Yeomanry, Brigadier General Jeff Smith, VD.
And who are these people?
No idea.
They never
Probably his mates.
Oh, it's one of the funniest bits I've ever seen. I think it's worth a read in that sense of you reading through it going, what the hell's going on?
Yeah. There's also a naval chapter, which, when we talk about the Battle of Dorking, where you get essentially an entire naval engagement summed up by a sort of a series of time-lapse snippets of information, which Chesney's narrator and his men receive, which tell them what an awful disaster has befallen the fleet. We get a naval chapter here, which is the same as everything else, more of the same, but wetter. And but the relatively short but 100 times more effective in terms of storytelling section in the Battle of Dorking. It's just a litany of stuff happening. And once again, you get a list of ships and captains at one point that just goes on and on and on. Mercifully not for a page, maybe for 2 paragraphs. Oh, yeah. It is entertaining.
I think it's entertaining in that, just that sense of, like, how? Like, why? It's just reading it going,
yeah.
Why is this going on as long as it is? Why is he going on about these bunch of people who I have absolutely no idea about? Why? You know, the descriptions get quite funny after a bit. I think the fact it gets so excessive with the repetition of it, it almost becomes like a running joke. But I think obviously he's not trying to do that. He's trying to make he's trying to shock the public.
Yeah. Well, fortunately, it eventually ends. And after we find out what happens to the traitor who we didn't know about in the first place, because we only read this version, we find that victory is won in Europe by the combined might of Britannia and her ally, quickly checks notes, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. And then we get to carve up big chunks of France, take it for ourselves. The Empire resumes its position as the greatest in the world. The end, hip hip huzzah. Yeah.
It's such a... As soon as you get to the bit where it mentions our ally, Kaiser Wilhelm, that's like that's the punchline. That's the punchline of the whole thing. No, actually, it almost feels like you read that part and think, was this all a joke? Was this written as a parody?
Yeah.
Of all of these?
It's a salacious... It's not even a potboiler. No. It's a salacious, gory page-turner for people to read over their morning chops and liver and cigarettes. Yeah. So who wrote this guff? Well, this LeCue guy, journalist, later weirdly, massive aeronautical and wireless
I was reading about
radio
that.
for the youngsters, wireless communication enthusiast, and obviously quite prepared to move with the times. But after this, his anti-French and anti-Russian invasion, as you mentioned earlier on, he followed up 12 years later in 1906 with his best-selling anti-German invasion fantasy, The Invasion of 1910, which was written as a serial for the Daily Mail, which I want to read, but probably shouldn't.
I'm wondering, is it just the same book, but with all the bits of the French and the Russians changed to German?
Could well be, couldn't it?
And it ends with, the problem is when he gets to the Kaisers, Tsar Nicholas turns up to help or something.
Yeah. I think it's important, though, when we think about the context about which these things were written. So you've got journalists like LeCue, unlike Chesney the Seasoned Soldier, they're part of the mainstream media, and as always, they're complicit in supporting and upholding all the conceits around empire, which is absolutely what they're doing here. And just this morning, weirdly, as these things often happen, just this morning I came across this quite randomly being posted on social media by a historian. So in 1901, a guy called Major Arthur Griffiths writes a chapter on the British Army in the London Illustrated News commemorative book, The Glorious Reign of Our Queen Victoria. He's a veteran of the Crimean War, this guy. He's a major and a veteran of the Crimean War. So by this point, he's probably going on 40 years past the Crimean War. And the Crimean War wasn't exactly the finest hour of British military command. But anyway, in this he says, no army since the days of the Romans has been so constantly engaged in war as the British. Wars waged under the most varying conditions and in almost all parts of the world. The Pax Britannica is an empty sound. It is forever broken. Troubles with nations on our distant frontiers, disturbances within newly acquired territories, the protection and relief of British subjects caught in the toils of distant potentates have kept the British Army busy against many far-off foes. Among them we have been war with Burma and annexation, war with Persia and the humbling of that power, war with China, with the occupation of Peking twice over, assisted by foreign allies, war against the cannibals, brackets, Maoris, of New Zealand, now the most peaceable and well-disposed of our fellow subjects, bloodthirsty and pertinacious war with the savage soldier-like Kaffirs, apologies, Zulus. The maintenance of authority upon the outskirts of our Indian Empire has led to unceasing warfare. It was calculated that between the years 1849 and 1881 in India alone, there were 44 expeditions against the hill tribes upon the frontier, small affairs, but often full of difficulty and costly in men and treasure. The Tira campaign, or that waged upon the northwest frontier in 1896-97, was the most serious of all. The country was rugged, the enemy almost indomitable, success was only slowly and painfully achieved. when the venturesome spirit of missionaries and travellers raised the ire of King Theodore of Abyssinia, Tewodrus II, Emperor of Ethiopia, the British Empire was led over the mountains of Rasselas to Magdala, in the very heart of the country. Undying hostility, culminating in outrage and massacre, brought well-deserved punishment upon another savage king, Kofi of Kumasi. The march was now through lethal swamps under a tropical sun, and the lesson has had to be repeated twice since. These may be called small wars. Blimey. So this is what you're reading over your chopped liver and onions at 8:30 in the club before you go to work as a fucking accountant's typist or something. So Griffiths, in a direct way and a fashion, I suppose, typically derisory to the nations and people being victimised, acknowledges the sheer level of violence being levelled by the British Empire at its peak in 1901. And of course, he sees it as justified and moral. And this is the background that something like the war in England in 1897 was being written. Okay, there are a few years separate perhaps, but certainly the Great Invasion of 1910. And in some ways, despite those attitudes existing when Chesney wrote his piece, his story manages to feel more grounded and critical and less blindly patriotic.
Yes.
And that makes it the more interesting tale to me, and certainly the one with the most longevity.
Which I think is the reason why it's the one everyone still talks about. Well, this,
and I think it's also the one, it certainly appealed to Wells as well. And Wells wasn't exactly a jingoistic saber rattler, was he?
Well, certainly that's what I find interesting about this. And out of all the ones in the collection, this is the most of its time story. I think you should read this as a sort of just to get an idea of what Victorian was thinking. Like what was... Because I always find what's one of the reasons I'm so attracted to invasion literature is that they can say a lot about the period they come out of. Like they say, they can tell you what were you frightened of at the time. Like I said, who is the big boogeyman at the moment? Like one of the ones I really like is a much later one. I've forgotten the writer's name. It's called The Red Napoleon.
Oh, not
and it's by an American writer. But the whole idea is the world gets conquered by a communist warlord.
Yeah,
during the 20s. But he's it's strange because it's written at the height of the sort of like Yellow Peril, and he's depicted as an Asian man. But the whole thesis of the book, which is quite radical for the period, the writer posits, is that our own racism is the reason they've won. It's because we treat them as being lesser than us. We underestimate what they're capable of.
And when was this written?
The 1920s.
And
it's all about, and it says it's our own prejudices are our downfall.
Yeah.
And it's the reason they've beaten us is because we spend more of our time looking down on them, treating them as our less, considering ourselves their betters. And that's why they're going to win eventually. And I thought that's quite a radical statement to make especially for the 1920s to say that.
It absolutely is, isn't it?
It's a very interesting read, worth checking out. I think it's obviously bits which are dated horrifically. It's there's still a bit of the casual racism in there, but for the time, it's quite as a message. It's very forward thinking.
Yeah, I'm going to have to check that out. Right, just for the sake of consistency, I'm now drinking a Camden Easy Hazy IPA. There you go.
Oh.
So going back to LeCue for a moment.
Yes.
One of the more amusing and fascinating things about him later in life is that in 1914 or 15, he claimed to be being targeted by German agents for having rumbled their schemes because he wrote a book called German Spies in England, An Exposure. And there's a passage by a guy called John Seaman in a 2009 edition of the West Middlesex Family History Society Journal. Isn't the internet amazing?
Oh,
right.
Wonderful.
So in the 2009 edition of the West Middlesex Family History Society Journal, it reads, during the early part of the First World War, LeCue lived at Sunbury Cottage in Upper Halliford. In 1914, he visited Sunbury Police Station and reported that strangers had been seen behaving suspiciously near his home. Once, he sent his manservant to make a similar report. LeCue also claimed he has received threatening letters. He asked for police patrols near his home to be increased. He repeated his concerns in letters to Scotland Yard and complained that the extra police protection he believed he had been offered had not been provided. This correspondence between him and Scotland Yard lasted into 1915 and stopped without the matter being resolved. This may have been when LeCue moved away from Upper Halliford. It seemed that the police did not take his report seriously and probably thought he could not separate actual events from ideas generated by his very active imagination. LeCue used these events to support an article he wrote that was critical of the security services for the People on 28th of February 1918. Wow. That's actually the setup for a really fun story.
Oh, that's a great spy novel in there, I think. You know,
Absolutely.
It's like an early Hitchcock or something. You know, one of the films Hitchcock
totally.
would have
The
made
police
when he was
don't
still...
believe you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of blokes keep turning up outside my house, but it turns out, they're German spies.
Yeah, mysterious figures trying to kidnap him or whatever.
Yeah, it's a good...
Weirdly, that happens in the Edith Nesbit story at the end.
Yes, it does.
And we never find out what they're about, do we? We'll get to that, though.
It's a common thread in a lot of these stories. There's a lot of stuff just sort of happens out of nowhere.
Yeah.
More so in this story, where it's just pulling stuff out of its arse almost all the time, I think.
Yeah. And Moorcock's got a fairly dim view of the queue as well.
Oh, he doesn't seem to like... You think he's included this more for historical value?
Yeah.
Than any
he says in the introduction that the basic story, and to some extent the method, is identical to Chesney's, but whereas Chesney was fired by messianic urgency, moral outrage, a sense of duty, which gave his prose its dignity and conviction, LeQueux, competent though he is writing only for money.
Or you can tell that he's the classic example of a jobbing writer. He's cashing in.
Yeah. And Moorcock doesn't stop there. Over subsequent paragraphs, he also dismisses it as cynical and devoid of moral or literary purpose.
You could clearly tell that after rereading it, Moorcock was really annoyed by it. I think we've been a lot more merciful on it than he ever would have been.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable. This actually gets us to our bit of characteristically sharp Moorcock criticism, because there's a little bit where he's been talking about all this stuff, and he says he manages to slag... So this is a book about Victorian fiction, and he manages to use it to slag off Robert Heinlein.
I mean, I've got to be honest, that's dedication. That's dedication to the bit, I think.
Yeah, he's not hanging around. So he says he's been banging on about how Chesney and his fiction was devoid of literary merit, and how most of the contemporary sci-fi... And he wrote this intro in 1975. And their authors fall into the same bracket.
Yeah.
He goes on to say, naturally, like Marie Corelli, we'll come to in a second, who was convinced of her own profundity, there are writers like Robert Heinlein who have pretensions to social criticism. This is embarrassingly unintelligent. But for their fans, who are usually of a naively messianic disposition themselves, brackets, Heinlein's most notable fan must be Charles Manson, close brackets, it puts their work somewhere above mere commercial fiction. As a further aside, I've often wondered how much Marie Corelli, perhaps the greatest bestseller of a day, is to blame for the popularity of that particularly obnoxious brand of sentimental spiritualism still so prevalent in our seaside towns and spas, our suburbs and stockbroker villages of the home counties. Oh, Mike. Blimey. So he's got it in for Maria Corelli now.
He never minced words, did
he? He certainly didn't.
No,
I had to look up Marie
Corelli.
Corelli.
I think.
I had to look up Marie Corelli because I had no idea who he was talking about.
No, I'm not familiar with the name myself, to be honest.
Corelli apparently was Queen Victoria's favourite writer. And she wrote a debut novel in 1886, and it was called A Romance of Two Worlds. It was a huge seller, and she wrote, I think, somewhere in the region of 25 more novels up to 1925, most of which sold extraordinarily well. There were a lot of themes of Christianity and spirituality and various other bits and pieces, and it seems that contemporary critics were of a similar mind to Moorcock. But it does make you wonder, if you get a best-selling female author in the 1890s and the early 1900s, your average Fleet Street critic is probably going to be an arsehole about them.
Oh, yeah.
So, she made good money, and she sold a lot of books, so good for her. And what's more, in the early days of cinema, 9 of her books were made into films between 1915 and 1926 by studios like Fox and Paramount. And the last one, Sorrows of Satan, by W.D. Griffiths, directed by W.D. Griffiths, founder of United Artists and director of, quickly checks notes, Birth of a Nation.
Although, I was reading about him recently, oddly enough, about one of the strangest moments of his career. I was some point in the 1914, I think, or 15. He went down to Mexico with another director, and they actually met Pancho Villa, the revolutionary.
Right.
And they filmed him out in the battlefield.
Yeah.
Well, Villa had invited them to come down because he wanted to make basically a propaganda film of him. And he famously said, a battle had happened, and they said, "Oh, we couldn't film it, sorry." And he said, "Don't worry, I'll reenact it for you now." So you can film us having a battle.
Amazing.
Oh, it's very... They made a film of it, which is quite fun. A very highly fictionalised one called... and starring Pancho Villa as himself.
Really?
Which,
Wow.
oddly enough, Antonio Banderas plays it.
That really is like
strange.
the Wild West of filmmaking. It?
Yeah, which is a period of history, filmmaking I love, because it's such a... Nobody really knows what they're doing, I think. The rule book hasn't quite been written yet, so they're just... Anything goes.
Yeah, that's the Wild West of filmmaking. Crazy.
Quite literally.
But anyway, I hope Marie Corelli made a few bob out of him. And she obviously made very, very good money. There's only one contemporary piece of writing about her, and it's by Mark Twain, who met her.
Oh.
And it's so offensive, I'm not even going to read it.
Oh.
Because it makes Mark Twain sound like a massive misogynistic prick.
Really?
Yeah, which he probably was. But
which is
yeah, I'm
quite
not going to read it
surprising,
because it's
knowing
just
apparently
fucking mean.
He was a big supporter of like women's suffrage and stuff, which is very... Because he was quite far ahead on quite a few topics, and then suddenly he'd come out with something which made you go, "Oh God."
Yeah, well, if you care to read it, just Google Mark Twain, Marie Corelli, and see what he said about her. It's just fucking mean-spirited and unpleasant.
Which I think is what's changed in history. You get writers like that now, who everyone seems to go after. They have write this mainstream fiction, which is, it isn't particularly breaking new ground or anything, but seem to treat them like they're the devil.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in some ways she was like, I don't know, was she something a cross between the J.K. Rowling and the Barbara Cartland of her day?
Oh, sounds very Barbara Cartland to me.
Yeah,
that's sort of very prolific, very rich, and you don't seem to know anyone who actually seems to like.
She claims to have been self-made and come from nothing.
Yeah,
but there are other people who say that she was a fantasist even when she talked about herself. So.
Yeah,
Who knows? So we've got 2 tales left. And the next one, Life in Our New Century, published in Harmsworth magazine in 1901 by journalist W.J. Wintle, is the Tomorrow's World of this whole setup. And it is interesting because it manages to make a number of predictions around how technology and industry would likely transform the 20th century. And to be honest... Other than expecting electric cars and monorails to dominate mass transit very quickly, and to be fair to Wintle, they could have, had we not abandoned trolleybus networks in major cities in favour of diesel-powered bus networks and trains. He was pretty close to the money. He was pretty on the money.
It's interesting. I can understand why Moorcock included it as well, rather than including like another bit of fiction, because I find it, once again, it's a great curiosity from the period. And I always get a bit of fun out of seeing how the past was going to see the future, how, what their educated guesses were at the time.
He predicts some things that are quite remarkable. So, he talks about airships. So, okay, maybe not airships, but he's very excited by developments with aeroplanes and talks about Hiram Maxim of machine gun fame.
Yes. But
he also predicts the streaming of live sports. When he talks about horse racing being beamed live to viewings in theatres via, in inverted commas, electroscope. Which, okay, his terminology is wrong, but has effectively predicted live sport streaming.
Yeah.
He predicts telegraph in your pocket, which is quite fucking savvy.
Speaks for itself.
Yeah. He predicts socialism with new municipal housing for the poor. And one of the weirdest and oddest things is he predicts, he doesn't say megastores, he just says stores. Because when he wrote this, the idea of a store was still relatively novel. But he predicts that large stores would potentially drive local shops and traders out of business, but says that essentially that could be a good or a bad thing if it benefits people more broadly. It's like, right, so he's basically predicted Asda megastores as well.
And he seems a bit on the fence. That he does seem like he's not trying. He doesn't want to make too many assumptions about the positivity of it. Like I remember reading the thing.
It's definitely about the technology rather than the ramifications of technology.
It's like the line where he's talking about socialism, like the sort of rise of socialism. If is it going to become the established model for the future? And he does sort of cover himself a bit by going, could be, could not. It's too early to say. So in that sort of terms, I think. But I do find it quite interesting as a text. And I think it's one of my favourite ones in there, I think. It's not a story, but I think just as an interesting curiosity piece. And I'm glad that Moorcock included it.
Yeah, I think it's good, and it's a nice little palate cleanser before the story Three Drugs by E. Nesbit. E. Nesbit, of course, being Edith Nesbit,
Yes.
socialist, activist, poet, and author of The Railway Children, among other things. So, turns out she wrote supernatural, ghost, and even though weird tales as a term wasn't coined at that point,
No.
this is effectively another weird tale.
But it would have called him fantasy at the time, usually, wasn't it? Like, fantasy was just a catch-all term for genre fiction. Is anything that has a fantasy, some sort of supernatural element to it was just a fantasy. But I always find it interesting, you read about all these Victorian writers, and you realise how diverse their writing is. Like, even ones who are associated with a particular genre often write outside it. They often did books which are completely different. But then you'll have people who are like literary fiction writers who would put out like a science fiction story or a ghost story, and I always found that quite interesting, but it seemed to be quite fast and loose. What people
Moorcock makes the point in the introduction, doesn't he, that critics at the time, rather than grouping things in terms of writers' intentions, they just group things in terms of this is about a space city or this is about something else. He says there's very little critical thinking when it comes to critics.
Yes.
So, yeah, that's interesting. So, I think this is one of the two tales in this that are really relatively conventional short stories. You've got the Jules Verne one, which is a little bit more lyrical.
Yes.
This one is, albeit firmly in the weird tale bracket, actually quite an effective thriller story.
Yes. It's more literary than the other ones, I think. The other ones, I think the other stories do have that more pulpy quality to them, I think. They do have that more, what some people would probably refer to as low culture.
Yeah.
Well, these are more, Nesbit and Verne were more established writers at the time. Although apparently...
I'll tell you what, for an author who was essentially known for writing children's books, this is an incredibly effective thriller. The way it's written, I think it's fantastic. The first paragraph is pretty great. It says, Roger Wroxham looked around his studio before he blew out the candle and wondered whether, perhaps, he looked for the last time. It was large and empty, yet his trouble had filled it, and, pressing against him in the prison of those four walls, forced him out into the world, where lights and voices and the presence of other men should give him room to draw back, to set a space between it and him, to decide whether he would ever face it again, he and it alone together. The nature of his trouble is not germane to this story. There was a woman in it, of course, and money, and a friend, and regrets and embarrassments, and all of these reached out tendrils that wove and interwove till they made a puzzle problem of which heart and brain were now weary. It was as though his life depended on his deciphering the straggling characters traced by some spider, who, having fallen into the inkwell, had dragged clogged legs in a black zigzag across his map of the world. I don't know if it's because I've just been reading William Le Queux, but this is like fucking awesome by comparison.
Great that Moorcock put it at the end, I think.
Yeah.
Really cap it off with a really well written, just very effective short story.
Yeah. And the story, on the whole, it reminds me a little bit of... It's kind of like William Hope Hodgson by way of Gerald Kirsch, but better written than either of them.
Yeah, it's very much in the classic tradition of British horror stories.
Yeah.
But in a more literary writer, much more... probably someone who was a better writer than them. And I don't know much about E. Nesbit as a writer, if I'm honest. I don't know too much of her work. So, did she write much genre work?
She did write ghost stories and supernatural short stories. But, interestingly, she was one of the founder members of the Fabian Society.
Yes, I knew that about her.
Which, to be honest, I think used to carry a little bit more weight when it came to socialism, when you consider that one of the co-chairs now is Wes Streeting.
Yeah, back then it was, I think, much more of a much more radical thing.
I think so.
Wells was a member as well, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was, yeah.
So she must have known Wells at the time, surely.
Yeah, well, you would think so, yes. They must have moved in the same circles.
Yeah.
But it's so strange coming to this story at the end because it's jarring in a good way, in a welcome way. And it continues to be excellent because the point of view character, Roger Wroxham, he finds himself confronted by three mysterious antagonists when he's walking along the Seine. And by page 3, it's already exciting, tense, And again, considering this is the work of someone who's predominantly known as a children's author, amazingly effective. And this is the last thing I'm going to read before we conclude this podcast, because these strong IPAs are starting to make my tongue feel really thick in my mouth. But let's go. It says, he blew out the candle and went quietly downstairs. It was 9 at night, a soft night of May in Paris. Where should he go? He thought of the Seine and took an omnibus. Of course, to everybody else in those days, an omnibus was a bus, not a selection of 3 alien novels. The chestnut trees of the boulevards brushed against the sides of the one that he boarded blindly in the first light street. He did not know where the omnibus was going. It didn't matter. When at last it stopped, he got off. And so strange was the place to him that for an instant it almost seemed as though the trouble itself had been left behind. He did not feel it in the length of 3 or 4 streets that he traversed slowly, but in the open space, very light and lively, where he recognised the Taverne de Paris and knew himself in Montmartre, the trouble set its teeth at his heart again, and he broke away from the lamps and the talk to struggle with it in the dark, quiet streets beyond. A man braced for such a fight has little thought to spare for the detail of his surroundings. The next thing that Wroxham knew of his outside world was the fact that he had known for some time that he was not alone in the street. There was someone on the other side of the road keeping pace with him. Yes, certainly keeping pace. For as he slackened his own, the feet on the other pavement also went more slowly. And now there were 4 feet, not 2. Where had the other man sprung from? He had not been there a moment ago, and now, from an archway a little ahead of him, a 3rd man came. Wroxham stopped. Then 3 men converged upon him, and like a sudden magic lantern picture on a sheet prepared, there came to kill him all that he had heard and read of Montmartre. Dark archways, knives, Apaches. Apaches is used quite regularly to mean sort of brigands or wrong-uns.
There was a street gang in Paris at the time, and they were called the Apache.
Oh!
They were called the Apache, which is the French pronunciation of Apache. And they were very common in the early 20th century. And the whole thing was they were kind of these working-class dandy criminals.
Right,
They'd be very flamboyantly dressed, but they were known to stalk people in the streets and then strangle them with scarves.
Oh, that makes so much more sense.
So that's what he's referring to, I think.
Oh, well, now I know. I'm so pleased you told me that, because it seemed a bit weird. So, Apache, and men who went away from homes where they were beloved and never again returned. He too, well, if he never returned again, it would be quicker than the Seine, and in the event of ultra-mundane possibilities, safer. So at this point, we're getting the impression that actually he's considering suicide by throwing himself in the Seine, I think, at this point. But it said, he stood still and laughed in the face of the man who first reached him. Well, my friend, said he, and at that the other 2 drew close. Monsieur walks late, said the first, a little confused as it seemed by that laugh. And will walk still later, if it pleases him, said Roger. Good night, my friends. Ah, said the second, friends do not say adieu so quickly, monsieur, will tell us the hour. I have not a watch, said Roger, quite truthfully. I will assist you to search for it, said the 3rd man, and laid a hand on his arm. Roger threw it off. That was instinctive. One may be resigned to a man's knife between one's ribs, but not to his hands pawing one's shoulders. The man with the hand staggered back. The knife searches more surely, said the second. No, no, said the 3rd quickly. He is too heavy. I, for one, will not carry him afterwards. They closed round him, hustling him between them. Their pale, degenerate faces spun and swung him around in the struggle. For there was a struggle. He had not meant that there should be a struggle. Someone would hear. Someone would come. But if any heard, none came. The street retained its empty silence. The houses, masked in close shutters, kept their reserve. The 4 were wrestling, all pressed together in a writhing bunch, drawing breath hardly through set teeth, their feet slipping, and not slipping, on the rounded cobblestones. The contact with these creatures, the smell of them, the warm, greasy texture of their flesh as, in the conflict, his face or neck met neck or face of theirs, Roger felt a cold rage possess him. He wrung 2 clammy hands apart and threw something off, something that staggered back, clattering, fell in the gutter, and lay there. So this is being written by a children's author, but to me, it's reading like John le Carré. I think it's terrific. You know, apart from the fact that I didn't know what a Apache was, and my fat IPA tongue has made me struggle with sentences. But that reads pretty fucking great.
I mean, the language is pretty contemporary as well. It doesn't feel dated. It doesn't, like, sometimes you read something from that era and you'll read, it sometimes has, like, the style of the period in a way where perhaps doesn't translate well. But you read some stuff, like that, for example, and it's held up very well. Like, maybe it's a cultural reference or two that might go past your people's heads and all that, but I think it's a very, very effective short story. And I think worth rediscovering.
At this point onwards, Roger escapes his chasers by ducking into a courtyard, enters a house where the resident, a doctor, takes him in and dresses his wounds, assuring him of safety and that he should stay the night, but things take a slightly unsettling turn. Where the bedroom he's staying in, there's a strange smell from behind a locked door that smells alternately of camphor and something weird. Which, I suppose, in some ways, that's like anyone's grandma's house when you're a kid. But it's a little bit sinister, and he's not particularly happy with it. But to cut a long story short, it turns out the doctor's a wrong-un. He's a former embalmer and vivisectionist who, after running out of inspiration with animal experiments, took to experimenting on people to test a 3-stage process that first almost kills the individual. So when he dresses Roger's wound, he applies an unguent to the wound, which is stage 1. Then one that revives them, and then one that causes the subject to trip balls, almost like experience weird things from the past. And trip balls Roger does. I don't think we really find out whether he really does actually communicate or hear the thoughts or conversations of an ancient pharaoh. But what we do know is he's tripping his tits off.
He certainly thinks he is.
Yeah. And he almost comes a cropper because the doctor makes one essential mistake when he realises it's working with Roger, whereas it hasn't worked with everybody else because for whatever reason they had illnesses or something like that, and they're all dead but preserved and embalmed in the room next to the bedroom that he put Roger in. The doctor makes one essential mistake, which is to try the process on himself, but he didn't untie Roger. So when he gets to the point where he's dying, Roger can't give him the 3rd dose. So he pegs it and dies in front of Roger, while Roger's tied to a chair in a house that he can't get out of, and all he can do is scream and shout.
Oh, that's a classic horror ending.
It's pretty cool, but one of the things that I found most warming about it is that he has this terrible experience, and I expected it to stay there, to stop there. And if it was a Gerald Kersh story, it would have. But there are like 2 more pages, so it continues. Well, it turns out the Apache who were trying to mug him hear him screaming and shouting because they've been watching the house because they realised he went in. So they go in and are so freaked out by what they find, they leg it, except for one of them who takes pity on him and frees him before also legging it. The end. So it turns out these Apache, whilst we don't really know, well, I didn't know originally why they were mugging him, but you've explained to me who they were. So they were just muggers. They were just dandy muggers. One of the dandy muggers takes pity on him and unties him from the chair before running off to join his compadres. I absolutely love that story, and I love that ending. It's short, it's quick, it's punchy, it's really well written, it's tense. The bizarre 4 pages where it suddenly turns into, holy shit, I'm being experimented on a madman, is so out of the blue. It's wonderful.
It feels like one of those things that would have been adapted like by the BBC in the 70s as part of like a play for today or something.
Totally. Yeah.
In a particularly weird a week for the BBC when they would occasionally just dabble in weird stuff like that.
Yeah, it'd be one of those episodes that might have been lost or taped over. But yeah, they happen to have 6 episodes out of 24 left that network DVD release, but this isn't one of them.
And this is the one if you asked them about the series, they'd say, "Oh, I remember the one when this happened."
Yeah,
a bloke was strapped to a chair and started hallucinating.
If you were to judge this collection by the themes within it, then this seems like a strange choice. But if you judge this collection purely based upon each story on its own merits,
yes,
I think the Battle of Dorking and this are my favourites. I like the Mission of the La Revenga, or whatever it's called. I just love this story as a weird tale.
Oh yes,
I think it's fabulous.
It's a solid, like, weird fiction story. And one I'm not quite sure. Is it that well known? I've been thinking, is it a particularly well known one? Because I don't hear it mentioned. Obviously with your Blackwoods, your William Hope Hodgsons.
If I still had the St. Michael 50 great stories of the macabre that I got when I was 13, I would pull it off the shelf and check. But I did Google it earlier, and the only references I could find to it in terms of availability, there are some collections of short stories by Edith Nesbit, and they're usually called something along the lines of The Three Drugs, or The Last Drug, or The Final Drug, because I think it's been titled various different ways, and other stories by E. Nesbit. But you never really know with those, because these days there are so many, because they're all in the public domain.
Yes.
There are so many shoddy print-on-demand
short
story collections. I honestly don't know, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if this hasn't popped up in, one of those Pan series in the 70s. Pan Supernatural series, or Pan Mysteries of the Unnatural, or
one of those stories that becomes
those
a bit of a staple of collections and anthologies.
Yeah. But that was Before Armageddon. So, Liam, thoughts on Before Armageddon?
I think it's a really, really strong collection. Even with, I think LeCue is easily the weakest one in it.
Yeah.
But even then, I think even at its worst, it's still interesting.
Yeah.
I think even at its lowest points, there's still, there's still value to it. Like, for example, I think the Q story is very much a historical curiosity. And you can still, a lot you can get from it, just from that. But then, as you said, there's some stories there which I think ripe for rediscovery as well.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think you're absolutely spot on. I think there's some good stuff in here. It doesn't quite make sense as an entire collection of stories. And
no.
after I finished, I reread the introduction to see where the references were to why he put some of these stories in. But he covers so many little pieces of ground in the introduction and goes off on a big essay. Yeah. He doesn't even mention this story. He doesn't even mention Life in Our New Century. He doesn't mention the Jules Verne one. So I'm guessing he just stuck these in because he liked them.
Yeah, he just wanted an excuse. There's two stories I really like. I want other people to read them.
Yeah.
They'll fit them in there somehow.
Yeah, good for him if he's got the clout to do that. So, and I'm glad he did.
And I'm wondering where he found some of these.
I really like that one.
I'm quite curious where he found what was it called? The article.
Life in Our New Century.
How did he find that?
W.J. Wintle. God knows.
Curious how he came across that, because that seems like an obscure thing to find.
All I can think is, in the 50s and 60s, he must have been going into tat shops and just coming across piles of magazines and leafing through them, thinking, I'll have that one for $1.
Yeah.
Just like we would do with a copy of Analog in a second-hand bookshop now for £1. He must have been doing all this stuff and coming across these things.
Would have been much more readily available at the time. I'm guessing a lot of Victorian and Edwardian magazines would have been a lot cheaper back then as well.
Yeah.
They probably didn't have. People probably didn't value them as much at the time.
Yeah, he probably got it in Pyatt's Tat Shop or something. Yeah.
And I imagine that's probably where a lot of these stories and these collections probably came from, with just him sifting through and finding, there's a story here this looks quite interesting, as it's never been anthologized since it came out. Probably no one's read it since it came out.
That's what he's doing as a kid in the rubble of London.
Which I think that's always the job of anyone curating something. I think you've always got to shine a light on things people don't know about. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, you know what? Thanks for coming along and talking to me about Before Armageddon, and I think in a couple of months, maybe sometime before Christmas, if you're up for it, we'll come back on and look at England Invaded.
We can do it. I'd be happy to do it. It's one story I find a lot of fun in that one. So,
I've still never read it. I read Before Armageddon in the late 80s or 90s. I only picked up England Invaded for the first time a couple of years ago, and I still haven't read it.
Yeah,
but there is a story in there by Blythe Muddersnook, which is possibly the greatest name I've ever heard in my life. Professor Blythe Muddersnook.
And one of those names, I hope it's a real name as well.
Yeah, I'm hoping so, but according to Marcus L. Rowland on his Forgotten Futures website, it's probably a pseudonym, but we don't know who of.
Oh, so, still interesting,
but,
then.
But it's called When the New Zealander Comes.
Yes, I know the one.
Professor Blythe Muddersnook.
I know, that's a very interesting story, actually. It's a very interesting...
I'll look forward to reading that and talking to you about it. All right, well, cheers, Liam.
Thank you very much.
Catch you next time.
And you. Thank you very much. Anytime.
Massive thanks once again to Liam for joining me to talk about some rare tales. We originally had this lined up well over a year ago, but Life events got in the way, as they sometimes do, but I'm delighted that we were able to hook it up, and we'll get Liam on again sometime in the future. In past podcast news, our last episode talking with Dave about Conan raked up some interesting thoughts and feelings, but I was really pleased to get some quality feedback on some of the things we went over. First, from Scott Butler, who said, "Excellent episode. Great coverage of the books and the vast swathe of Conan stories and movies. Even better, I think the discussion of the darker side of the writer was important. It's too easy to write things off as that was of another time. Your observations that it clearly wasn't just of its time when we view the news today are spot on. I'm glad you had the balls to attack that conversation and express your opinions whether others might shy away and dance around the topic. Bravo to both of you." Dave's quote, "The ancient evil has returned and darkness falls upon the land once again," excellent line, and I couldn't think of a better way to summarise those views under discussion. Thanks, Scott. Lovely to hear your thoughts. And in a similar vein, over on YouTube, our mucker Glenn commented like this. "You've been covering so much good stuff lately, and this is no exception. Like a lot of our age and background, I suspect, I started with the Sphere, Elsbrag de Camp and Lynn Carter paperbacks, and in my case, I think I got them from our local village library in Rainford near St Helens, or from a really cool little second-hand bookstall in Ormskirk Indoor Market. I really miss those sort of stalls and the prices the books seem to go for. I can remember the gaudy covers and lots of books called Conan the ... or Conan and ... or Conan of ... and I didn't really get to read much of Howard's own creation until later. The 1982 movie and TSR's Conan RPG were big factors in my understanding and exploration of Hyboria in the mid-80s, and like yourself, I look back on Conan the Destroyer with a lot more affection now than I probably did then. I started reading H.P. Lovecraft possibly a bit earlier, and again, the Chaos EM RPG was my intro along with the Granada anthologies. At the time, I genuinely didn't get the worldview of either Howard or Lovecraft, but did begin to see it as I read more and more and found out about their letter-writing habits. I'm from quite a conservative family background, with my dad having been a bobby, and the family tending to a fairly right-wing mindset, which I remember becoming aware of during the miners' strike and Thatcher's residence in Number 10. I'd only really found my own much more left-wing political viewpoint later in my teens and when at university, but by then I'd read up more on Lovecraft and later Howard, and was going through that inner argument about separating the writing from the writer. I still struggle at times with it a little, if I'm honest, but as time's gone by I've been able to see that their writing is fantastic, groundbreaking, and hugely influential, whilst being able to say more comfortably that their worldviews and their ideas on others were appalling. I can still read and enjoy the books, but am mindful of the shite they believed when it came to race, culture, and so on. It's very timely to hear when you put together this episode, it being the day after the riots that ran across England. Your comments about the issues of divisiveness and the ongoing influence in the media and society of the far right were spot on, and some of the best and most honest explanations I've listened to lately. Thank you for tackling what is a serious, heavy subject, but one that does need talking through. As a lighter aside, Hull FC played Saints on the Saturday that there were riots, and I saw a local news reporter interview an elderly couple of Hull fans who'd come from the match and asked them their opinions of what was going on, and the lady replied, "We just didn't play well enough," or words to that effect, before the reporter told her he meant what did she think about the rioting, and she appeared to have not known about them. Hopefully they, the riots, not the Hull fans, can become history and we can learn and move forward. As ever, thanks for the podcast and content. All the best, Glenn. You know, Glenn, it never ceases to amaze me how many of us there are out there with such similar backgrounds and ways into this stuff, even if your comment does include a reminder of just how shit Hull FC are at the moment. For non-rugby league aligned listeners, we got absolutely wagged by Glenn's team St Helens that day, just to pile on the misery. But thanks for the feedback, Glenn and Scott. It's sometimes easy to get lost in your own hyperbole when talking about this stuff, raw as it can get at times like that. So hearing your feedback is extremely grounding and very welcome. And thanks as always to our patrons for keeping this show on the road. First those without Tia, Anthony Piconti, Tim Cardos, Dave Dempster and Sebastian Weetabix. And our Chaos engineers Andrew Cicluna, Andrew Spong, Andrew Van Ness, Anthony Porter, Benjamin Fletcher, Brandon Mays, Dan Charnley, Dave Griffiths, Dave Voxman, Gabriel Laycock, Harvey Faulkner Aston, Jim Kirkland, Jim Jupp, John W. Lays, Jules Lawrence, Mal Pertwee, Matt Saltz, Nick Hopkinson, Ofer Ziv, Paul McRandall, PJ Cooper, Scott Butler, Simon Perrins, and new to our ranks plaiting the chaotic matter of the Grey Fees, Aid von Stout. As is customary now, I dropped Ed a line to see where he is in the world, and he responded as follows. Hi Andy, to be honest it's quite out of character for me to dig deep, or shallow in this case, but anything that adds to the beer selection in your excellent work is good with me. I want to thank you and Phil and the rest of the varied crew for what has so far been a fun, nostalgic trip that keeps me interested and laughing. One complaint though, it's costing me a fortune tracking down all the bloody obscure books in the charity shops. I remember when you had bloody shelves of Guy and Smith stuff. I'm now regretting not buying any of it. I'm based in the back pocket of the arse end of nowhere in deepest, darkest Norfolk. I'm guessing I'm of a similar age. Grew up in the 70s and 80s on a diet of Ace and Sphere Conan paperbacks. Got into Moorcock through a mate in the year above at school who made Stormbringer sound like just the most amazing thing to a nerdy D&D player. And from there, some things just never change. Cheers for all the enjoyment and keep with it. Welcome aboard, Ed, and thank you for the support. It means the world when people dig what we're doing. And of course, thanks to our crafty Jugaderos, Alexander Harris, Christian Hundal, Graham Holden, Liam Turner, Loz, Mark Taylor, Matthew Broom, Sean Twist, Toby White, and, straight into the Terminal Cafe with a bang and a flurry of winnings, Taylor Lavery. Thank you, Taylor, for joining us at the Tables of Chance. An eternal thanks to our patron demons, Alistair Davison, Andy Clark, Andy Darby, David Lee, Fred Quiche, Gareth Wilson, Glenn Sawyer, Greg Faulkner, Gwen Barlow, Ian Stead, Imria, Jenny Stim, Jason Vogel, Joe Monty, Jonathan Sharp, Lee Gary, Mark Hebden, Marius Latauskas, Miles Reed-Labato, Neil Burton, Paul Hillary, Randall Gatlin, Steve Round, Tom Murphy, Tony Malazzo, the OG patron, Norman Beresford, and last, but never least, Robert McMillan. Okay, enough of my blather. Don't forget you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram with the handle @BreakfastRuins. You can email us at breakfastruins@outlook.com. The webpage is breakfastintheruins.com. BITR Breakfast in the Ruins Radio is live on Radio Garden or via the web player at breakfastintheruinsradio.blogspot.com. It's on some other radio players too. We have our Patreon page and there are a few extra odds and sods on there, including a couple of recent Patreon extra podcasts. But for now, take care, stay safe, and we will meet again soon on the Moonbeam Roads.